The day she threw the report at his chest, he didn't flinch. The paper struck him hard enough to fan open against his tie before sliding to the floor. And for one suspended second, nobody in the conference room breathed. 47 people stood around that long glass table pretending to study screens, not faces, while Elena Voss looked at the man she'd just humiliated and said in a voice so calm it felt worse than shouting that even the janitor downstairs showed better judgment than he did. Then she added something that stayed with him far longer than the sting of the papers. She said, "Men like you should learn early that loyalty without value is just another form of begging." He bent, gathered the pages, straightened them, and quietly returned to his place as if she had done nothing at all. But everybody in that room knew something had been broken. The worst part was not the insult. It was the silence that followed it, the silence that told him no one there intended to stand beside him. Welcome to his hidden worth, the place for stories about the people who are underestimated until the truth makes everyone choke on what they once believed. If you're new here, subscribe and stay with us because this one doesn't just hurt, it lingers. Her name was Elena Voss, and by 34 she had built herself into the kind of woman who made entire rooms shift before she even spoke. She had inherited a respectable real estate and investment company from her father, then sharpened it into something feared in Manhattan. She ran 12 floors in a midtown tower, commanded hundreds of employees, and wore authority the way some women wore perfume lightly, beautifully, and everywhere. She was elegant without softness, brilliant without warmth, and so disciplined that even kindness seemed to require clearance before it could appear on her face. People admired her. People envied her. People also feared her, which, if Elena was honest, had always felt more useful. His name was Marcus Webb. In 2016 he was 26, poor in the practical, exhausting way that never looked dramatic from a distance, but controlled almost every decision he made. He had a business degree from a state school in Ohio, a mother who had died when he was in college, and a cousin in Cleveland who had once lent him $300 so he could stay afloat long enough to make it to New York for interviews. The suit he wore on the day he got hired had belonged to a friend. The shoes pinched. The dry cleaning cost him his grocery budget for the week. He still walked into the Voss Tower with his back straight because dignity was one of the few things poverty had not managed to take from him. Elena had not hired him personally. Human Resources had processed him after a top-tier evaluation score and a recommendation that quietly noted unusual judgment under pressure. By the time Elena noticed his name, Marcus Webb was already part of the machinery. To her, that was what he remained, machinery, a function, a dependable background presence who made the day run smoothly and never asked for the kind of attention reserved for people who mattered. He was the first one in, the last one out, the man who knew where every contract was, which board member hated which wording, which investor preferred short memos, which driver needed to be called when Elena worked late, and what kind of coffee sat untouched beside her when she was furious. He remembered everything. He anticipated problems before others noticed them. He made himself useful in a building where usefulness was the only language some people respected. But usefulness was not the same as being seen. From the beginning, Elena corrected him in public more often than in private. If there was a mistake, even a minor one, she made sure the room heard it. If he did something well, she accepted it the way people accept electricity and a wall necessary, invisible, unthanked. Once, during his first 6 months, Marcus stayed all night rebuilding an investor packet after corrupted data wrecked the original files. At 8 the next morning, Elena took the finished packet from his hand, flipped through it, and asked, with 3 vice presidents watching, why the font spacing on page 12 looked amateur. Marcus had been awake for 23 hours. He apologized. She moved on. He bought the cheapest coffee in the lobby and went back to work. But humiliation has a way of accumulating. It is rarely one giant moment. More often, it is 100 smaller ones that teach a person exactly where they stand. There was the morning she made him wait outside her office holding a stack of binders while she finished a personal call. Then opened the door and said in front of 2 senior analysts, "You're still here?" I assumed you'd know enough to put those down somewhere useful. There was the client dinner where she introduced everyone by name and title and then referred to Marcus only as the aide. There was the winter fundraiser where he arrived with her backup speech after a printer disaster, and Derek Haas, standing at Elena's side with a champagne glass in his hand, looked Marcus up and down and said, "It's always nice when the help can run." Elena heard it. Elena smiled at the donor she was speaking to. Elena did not correct him. That was Derek, Elena's fiancé. Derek Haas came from private equity money, old family networks, and the kind of polished male confidence that made arrogance look almost tasteful if you weren't paying close attention. He was handsome, careful, and socially perfect in the way men become when life has removed consequences from their path early enough. He knew which schools to mention, which watches to wear, which jokes to make, which old money women to charm, and which poorer men to diminish without leaving fingerprints. He wasn't cartoonishly cruel. That would have been easier to defend against. Derek was worse. He was believable. He insulted with amusement. He cut with a smile. He made Marcus feel small in rooms full of people who would later swear they had never noticed anything at all. Marcus noticed Derek from the start, not because he was jealous, not because he was suspicious of rich men on principle. He noticed him because Derek's curiosity about Elena's company was too specific to be casual. Derek wanted access to board materials he did not need. He asked about debt structures, silent subsidiaries, timing windows, exposure on certain development holdings. He made his questions sound like fiancé interest, future husband concern, strategic admiration. But Marcus had grown up reading tone as survival. He knew when someone was asking to understand and when someone was asking to map. And Marcus was already sensitive to danger because he had been studying the company from angles Elena herself no longer had time to study. What he slowly realized chilled him. The threat to Elena was not an obvious external enemy. It was inside the company, built through relationships, signatures, timing, and patience. Derek had formed a quiet alliance with two senior board members, Hargrove and Singh, men ambitious enough to call greed governance if the paperwork looked respectable. Together they were building a structure around one particular subsidiary LLC, shifting exposure, redirecting valuation pressure, and preparing the conditions for a controlled crisis. If the market moved the wrong way at the right moment, Elena would be blamed for strategic negligence, forced to cede emergency authority, and stripped of control while the company she had bled to preserve would be acquired from within at collapse pricing. Marcus understood the shape of the trap months before anyone else. He also understood something much less practical and much harder to admit. He cared what happened to Elena, not as an employee protects a boss. As a man watches someone brilliant walk too close to a cliff and realizes, against his better judgment, that her falling would break something in him too. So he began intervening quietly. He corrected language in documents that would have exposed liability later. He rerouted small flows of money headed toward shell structures nobody was meant to notice. He sent anonymous questions to auditors that created delays without setting off alarm bells. He learned enough after-hours compliance law from library databases and borrowed legal guides to know how to trigger an external review without attaching his own name. He did all this while making $44,000 a year, splitting rent in a narrow apartment he could barely afford, and eating reheated soup at his desk more nights than not. There were weeks he sent part of his paycheck to his cousin Diane because her son's asthma medication costs had spiked. There were months he skipped replacing worn shoes because the company needed him looking polished, more than his feet needed comfort. Nobody in that glass tower knew how often the man keeping their schedules together went home and sat in the dark because turning on another lamp felt like one expense too many. And while he was quietly protecting Elena's world, Elena kept teaching him he meant nothing in it. One afternoon she called him into an executive meeting because a forecast packet had been sent without an attachment. The omission wasn't even his. It was an analyst's error. Elena knew that by the time Marcus entered the room. She still held up the packet and asked, before 6 executives, "Do you enjoy incompetence, Marcus, or are you simply devoted to it?" He answered that he would fix it immediately. Derek leaned back in his chair and said, almost lazily, "You have to admire the consistency." A few people smiled because rich men like Derek had a way of making cowardice look social. Elena did not smile right away. Then she looked at Derek, saw amusement on his face, and let herself laugh too. It was brief. Almost nothing. That made it worse. Marcus stood there while the woman he had been protecting laughed with the man trying to destroy her. That night he stayed until nearly midnight rebuilding a risk package for a land deal Elena would present the next morning. When she used it in the boardroom, she did not mention his name. Then came the worst humiliation before the fall. It happened during a holiday donor event on the executive floor. Investors, their spouses, senior staff, polished glasses, soft music, all of it designed to make power look effortless. Elena asked Marcus to retrieve a contract addendum from her office. When he returned, Derek intercepted him near the bar and loud enough for the surrounding circle to hear, asked whether Marcus had ever considered that the only reason men like him remained loyal was because they knew they would never rise any higher anywhere else. The circle went quiet. Marcus said he had work to do. Derek stepped closer and said, "No, really, I'm curious. Is devotion easier when failure is your natural altitude?" Elena was 4 feet away. She heard every word. Marcus looked at her. It was not a dramatic look. Just one direct second. A human appeal so small it almost wasn't visible. And Elena, in a fitted black dress, glass in hand, looked back at him and said, "If you are done hovering, Marcus, some of us are trying to have an evening." He walked away carrying the addendum with steady hands. He reached the service hallway before his breathing finally broke. He put one hand against the wall, lowered his head, and stood there alone, swallowing down the kind of humiliation that leaves no bruise and yet somehow hurts longer than a blow ever could. This story is fictional and created for entertainment purposes only. But what sat inside Marcus that night was not fictional at all. It was the quiet devastation of realizing that being loyal to someone does not mean they will ever feel obligated to protect your dignity in return. And still, even after that night, he stayed. Which raises the question at the center of this whole story: why would a man continue guarding a woman who had never once guarded him? Part of the answer was simple. He believed in the company. Elena's father had built something real before his death. Something that created jobs and carried weight in neighborhoods where other firms only extracted profit and vanished. Marcus had seen what some of their housing projects meant to ordinary people. He could not bear the thought of Derek and his allies turning that legacy into another private theft. But that was not the whole answer. The rest of it lived in smaller moments Elena herself barely noticed. The way she once spent 20 quiet minutes on the phone getting an employee's sick child into a specialist program, then ordered Marcus not to tell anyone she had done it. The way she read every line of a scholarship proposal before approving it because she hated performative philanthropy. The way her face changed, just for an instant, when she stood alone by the windows after difficult board meetings and let the exhaustion show. Marcus saw those fragments. The private brilliance. The private burden. The woman beneath a weapon. He saw enough to understand that cruelty was not all she was, and that made his position worse, not better. If she had been empty all the way through, leaving would have been easier. In early 2019, Derek moved against him. He did it with the smoothness of someone practiced in making damage look responsible. At a private dinner, over wine and concern, Derek told Elena that a source near the board had raised troubling questions about Marcus. Internal pricing strategy had appeared, in altered form, inside a competitor's acquisition playbook. Derek produced a backdated email that looked plausible enough to frighten someone already trained to distrust weakness. He did not accuse Marcus with anger. He did it with regret, which is the most persuasive costume betrayal can wear. He told Elena he hoped it wasn't true. He told her he knew Marcus had been around a long time. He told her he would hate for loyalty to make her blind. The next morning Elena made her choice. She did not call Marcus into private. She did not ask one careful question. She did not give him the dignity of hearing the accusation before the room heard it. At 9:12 a.m., in full view of the executive floor, with assistants, analysts, compliance staff, and 2 clients being escorted past the glass corridor, Elena told Marcus his access was suspended pending investigation into a serious internal breach. She said it so crisply it sounded administrative. But then she added, "I warned myself not to mistake obedience for integrity." That line hit him harder than the suspension itself, because obedience was exactly what she had always demanded from him, and now she was using it as evidence of emptiness. One of the analysts stared at her desk. Another looked at Marcus with open panic and said nothing. Derek stood near Elena's office door with a grave expression so perfectly measured it might have won awards. Security arrived. Elena instructed Marcus to leave his company phone, his laptop, and his badge at the lobby desk. She told him his personal things would be boxed. He said quietly that there were a few papers in his desk he needed. She answered, "Anything of value to you should have been kept separate from company property." He looked at her then, not pleading, not angry, just searching her face as though one final time he was trying to see if there was a human way back into the room. There wasn't. Security escorted him to his desk. Someone had already begun watching. He packed a photograph of his mother, a worn notebook full of work observations, a cheap umbrella, and the emergency inhaler he kept for occasional winter attacks. That was all. When he reached the elevator bank, one of the junior receptionists, a girl no older than 22, looked like she might cry. She almost stepped forward. Derek glanced her way, and she froze. Marcus walked into the elevator carrying a small cardboard box and the weight of years no one around him had earned the right to measure. That should have been the end of him and their story. But before Elena had publicly broken him, Marcus had already prepared for the possibility that Derek would strike. Months earlier, he had triggered an external compliance process through an anonymous attorney filing. He had preserved records, created timelines, and duplicated hidden evidence far from the company server. He knew if Derek ever moved openly against him, it would mean the internal trap was nearing completion. His removal could not stop the audit, because by then the audit would already be moving through channels too formal to kill quietly. So Marcus disappeared from the building, but not before making sure the truth would keep walking after him. 3 weeks later, early findings began surfacing. At first, Elena thought it was a manageable irregularity, a subsidiary review, a mismatched disclosure chain. Then more came: fund redirections, signature patterns, internal timing manipulations. By the time outside counsel laid out the structure, the truth was too large to rationalize. Derek's name appeared where he had sworn it could not. Hargrove and Singh had exposure on documents Elena had never seen. The quiet mechanism Marcus had sensed was real, and it was nearly complete when he began undermining it. The controlled crisis had been scheduled with breathtaking patience. Another quarter, maybe less, and the company would have been ripped out from under her. The engagement ended in a silence so cold even Derek's charm froze inside it. Civil actions followed. Emergency board reshuffling followed. The LLC was frozen. External counsel widened the review. The press never got the full story, but inside the company the damage was seismic. Elena survived it professionally because the structure Marcus had built from the shadows had bought her enough time to survive it at all. What she did not understand, not until months later, was how much of her survival belonged to the man she had walked out under guard. In the fall, her chief legal officer entered her office with a folder and a face she had learned not to ignore. Inside that folder was a timeline. Anonymous filings. Document corrections. Rerouted approvals. Flagged discrepancies. Subtle interventions that, taken alone, looked like nothing, and taken together, looked like a human body placed between her and disaster for nearly 2 years. The legal officer let her read in silence. Then he said the sentence that split her life in two. Whoever protected this company knew the internal structure intimately, anticipated Derek's moves, and kept your name clear long enough for outside review to catch up. It was Marcus. Elena sat there as if gravity had changed. At first, she tried to stay analytical. She read each page twice, then 3 times. She traced dates with her finger. She remembered meetings. She remembered dismissals. She remembered every time Marcus had seemed to know something just before trouble arrived. The memory that undid her was not the suspension. It was the holiday event, Derek's voice, Marcus looking at her for 1 second, and her choosing social convenience over his humanity. The room blurred. She closed the folder and opened it again because her mind kept rejecting what the pages were saying. The man she had ridiculed, publicly diminished, falsely accused, and thrown away had been the one standing between her and collapse the entire time. That night she went home to an apartment large enough to echo and sat on the kitchen floor in the dark. She did not turn on music. She did not call anyone. The city glowed beyond the windows like a place she had somehow conquered without ever learning how to live in it. 4 hours she sat there replaying every humiliation she had handed Marcus as if memory itself were a punishment and she had finally become unable to refuse it. She saw the report hitting his chest. She saw him standing with a binder while she let people smirk. She heard herself saying obedience was not integrity. Somewhere after midnight she finally broke. Not elegantly. Not silently. She folded forward on the cold floor and cried with a kind of helplessness usually reserved for private losses nobody else can witness. Only this loss was one she had authored herself. The next morning she called HR. No forwarding address. She called payroll. Nothing beyond the separation records. She found his emergency contact, a cousin in Cleveland named Diane. The number rang twice, then went to voicemail. Elena called again. And again. She sent a message asking, with more restraint than she felt, if there was any way to contact Marcus. No reply came. That was the beginning of the search. At first, Elena approached it the way powerful people approach problems, through process, money, systems, reach. She hired a private investigator. Then a second one because the first was too slow. She had Marcus's old addresses reviewed, old subway card usage checked through legal channels her attorney told her not to overuse, old employment records flagged. She learned how quickly a man who wanted to vanish could do it if he had no vanity left tying him to the places that once knew his name. There were traces of temporary work in Newark, a logistics company. Later, a payroll stub from a warehouse in Scranton. Then nothing for months at a time. Deadlines, dead screens, dead ends. She began doing things herself. She went to the sublet Marcus had rented in Manhattan, a narrow unit already repainted by the new tenant. She stood in that doorway while a stranger apologized and said she had moved in long after he left. Elena looked at the cheap blinds and worn radiator and understood, perhaps for the first time in her adult life, the scale of comfort she had always taken for granted. Marcus had gone home from the Voss Tower to this. He had protected a woman who dismissed him and then slept in a place small enough that grief would have had nowhere to hide from him. She drove to Cleveland in sleep to speak to Diane in person because phone calls had become unbearable. Diane opened the door, took one look at Elena's coat, her car, her posture, and knew immediately where she belonged in Marcus's old life. For a long moment, Diane said nothing. Elena told her she was not there to hurt him. Diane replied, "That would have been more convincing before." Elena absorbed it because she had earned it. Diane eventually let her in. Marcus had called months ago. He said he was working. He sounded tired but steady. He had asked, specifically, that no one connected to the company be told where he was. Then Diane added the line Elena carried home like glass in her chest. He said if anyone came looking, it would probably be because they needed something from him again. Elena cried alone in the rental car outside Diane's house until the windshield blurred. The search stretched into seasons. She followed a false lead to Boston after an accountant there claimed a quiet consultant matching Marcus' description had helped untangle a distressed portfolio. By the time she arrived, he had already left. She flew to Newark after learning he had once shared an apartment with two men from a logistics firm. They remembered him as polite, private, impossible to know, the kind of person who paid his part early and disappeared before friendship became expectation. She traced another lead to a small office outside Philadelphia, only to discover it belonged to a different Marcus Webb entirely, a 58-year-old tax preparer with no connection to her. She stood in a train station after that mistake and for the first time wondered if she deserved never to find him. By 2021, the search had ceased to be a campaign and become something raw. Obsession, penance, hope, turned into routine so she would not have to admit how frightened she was of dying with the apology still trapped inside her. She kept his file in her bag. She read his timeline on flights and cars and hotel rooms. She began marking the margins with questions no legal record could answer. What had he eaten the night she had him escorted out? Where had he slept that first week? Had he hated her? Had he ever loved her? Had he known, on the days she was worst, that there was still some part of her worth protecting? The questions changed her. She became more careful with employees. She stopped humiliating people when she was angry. She started asking names instead of titles. She built scholarship funds in silence. None of it made her good enough to undo what she had done. But grief was teaching her the shape of the person she should have been before loss forced the lesson. There were nights she dreamed she found him in a crowd and woke up with the feeling of his absence pressing on her chest like physical weight. There were evenings she stayed late in the office not because work needed her, but because Marcus had once stayed late for her so many times, and she could not bear the thought that those hours had vanished into nothing. There were days her executive assistant brought coffee, and Elena heard herself say thank you with a softness that would have been unrecognizable years earlier. The whole company noticed she had changed. Nobody knew why. Or maybe some of them suspected. Maybe shame has a smell. By 2022, even the investigators had grown quiet. Leads dried up. Digital traces were thin. Elena still looked. She simply stopped talking about it. Searching became private, almost sacred, because hope had become too fragile to expose. Then a junior employee named Priya changed everything. Priya had worked around Marcus early in her career and remembered the precision of his writing. One Saturday, she sent Elena a screenshot from a small online business forum used by independent consultants handling distressed accounts in Western Pennsylvania. The username was generic, the profile blank. But the phrasing in a response about capital restructuring was unmistakable, controlled, exact, skeptical of flashy language, gentle in correction without ever sounding timid. Priya's message contained only one line. I think this is him. Elena stared at the screen so long her vision blurred. Her hands shook. She did not delegate. She did not call legal. She did not send an investigator first. On an October morning, she drove herself west through gray light and low hills, every mile tightening something in her chest until breathing felt like work. The address connected to the account led to a modest shared office outside Pittsburgh. No polished lobby, no marble. No power signals except the kind that come from people quietly trying to rebuild their lives. Elena sat in her car across the street for nearly 20 minutes. She had rehearsed this for 3 years. She had written versions of what she would say in hotel stationery margins, airplane notebooks, the backs of meeting agendas. She had imagined a clean confession, controlled and complete. But as she stared at that office door, all she felt was terror. Not terror of rejection. Terror that she would see in Marcus's face a calm indifference, proving she had arrived too late to matter. She went in anyway. The room was small, 4 desks. October light through plain windows. A printer in the corner. 3 people working quietly, and there he was. Marcus sat at a corner desk in a blue shirt with the sleeves rolled once at the wrist. He looked older, leaner, steadier somehow. Not harder, just less available to harm. The years had settled inside him in a way that made him seem both more ordinary and more difficult to reach. He looked up because the room was too quiet not to notice her entrance. His eyes found hers. For a second, nothing in the world moved. He did not stand. She walked toward him on unsteady legs. Every polished sentence she had prepared vanished. There were no witnesses she cared about impressing anymore. No image to maintain. No power left worth protecting. I found you, she said, and her voice was already breaking. Marcus looked at her for a long time before answering. I didn't make it easy. I know. The others in the room sensed the force of something private and left one by one with soft, respectful movements. Then it was only them and the October light and years of unsaid things. Elena stopped 5 feet from his desk. I know what you did for me, she said, for the company. I know about the filings, the corrections, the audit trail, everything. I know Derek set you up. I know I let him. I know I did worse than let him. I joined him. Marcus said nothing. Her hands shook harder. I searched for you in New York, in Newark, in Newark, in Boston, in Cleveland, in Philadelphia. I followed bad leads. I sat outside places hoping they were yours. I talked to people who remembered you, and every time they described you, I realized they had seen more humanity in you than I ever allowed myself to see. I have wanted to say this to you for 3 years, and none of it feels big enough. His expression changed a little at that, not softened. Open, perhaps? I humiliated you, she said, again and again. I let him degrade you. I let whole rooms believe you were small because it was convenient for me. Then when the moment came that I should have defended you, I accused you instead, publicly, cruelly. I took the one thing a man should not have to beg for from anyone, his dignity, and I did it like it was management. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the heater. I was wrong about you, she whispered. No, that's not enough. I was wrong about myself. Because no decent woman could have looked at what you gave and treated you the way I treated you. And yet you still protected me. Marcus lowered his eyes briefly, then looked back at her. I didn't do it because you deserved it every day. I know. I did it because I couldn't watch them destroy everything your father built. And because he stopped. Elena waited, tears already on her face. And because loving you had stopped being a choice long before I understood what it was costing me. The words landed between them with the force of a truth delayed too long. Elena closed her eyes for 1 second as if the room itself had tilted. When she opened them again, there was no executive composure left, only a woman stripped down to remorse and longing. I loved you too, she said, and it came out like a confession dragged through years of pride. I just didn't know what I was looking at until I had already destroyed it. I felt it in fragments. In the way I trusted your presence even while I was cruel to it. In the way a room felt wrong when you weren't in it. In the way nothing I built after you left ever felt whole. But I was a coward inside my own armor. And by the time I understood what you were to me, you were gone. Marcus looked at her with something deep and wounded in his eyes. Do you know what the worst part was? She shook her head, unable to speak. It wasn't Derek. It wasn't even the suspension. He stood then, slowly, and she felt the old nearness of him like a shock. It was that I kept hoping each time you humiliated me that it would be the last time. That somewhere in you there was a line you wouldn't cross. And when you had security walk me out, I realized I had been protecting a woman who would never protect me back. The tears on her face came harder. She nodded because there was nothing to defend. You're right. I went home with a box and $53 in my checking account. Do you know that? His voice was not raised. That made it unbearable. I slept 2 nights in a room so cold I could see my breath because I was afraid to use the heater. I kept thinking about your face when you said those things in front of everyone. I kept asking myself how I could have misread someone so badly. Elena covered her mouth, shattered by the image of him carrying that small box into cold emptiness while she remained in heated glass above the city. Marcus, I am not telling you this to punish you, he said. I've had years to live with it. I survived it. But if you came all this way for the truth, then take the whole truth. You were the person I would have done anything for, and for a long time you were also the person I least wanted to see ever again. She took a step closer. I know I can't erase any of that. I know I don't deserve forgiveness because I found you. I know loving you now doesn't cancel what I did then. But I need you to hear me anyway. I came because I could not keep breathing inside a life built over the place where your absence was buried. I came because every city I searched only made one thing clear. Losing you was not a consequence. It was the truth of my life. I love you, not because you saved me, Not because you were right about everything. Because somewhere inside the wreckage of who I was, you were the only person who ever gave me loyalty without vanity, care without performance, and honesty without trying to own me. I love you because when I finally saw your worth, it reordered mine. Marcus looked away toward the window. Outside, the town moved in its ordinary rhythm, untouched by their history. When he turned back, his face had changed again, softer now, but careful. I wanted not to love you anymore, he said. I tried. I built a different life because it was the only way I knew to survive what happened. But when you walked in just now, he exhaled. The truth is, I still feel everything. She laughed once through tears, a broken sound full of relief and grief at the same time. Then don't let me leave with only half of this said. He took one step closer. If this begins again, it cannot begin on the lie we used to live inside. It won't. You don't get to love me in private and diminish me in public. I won't. You don't get to make me responsible for carrying all the tenderness while you hide inside power. I won't. Her voice steadied. I learned too late what that cost. I will not ask you to pay it again. He searched her face for a long moment. And perhaps this is what forgiveness really looks like when it is not easy, a man measuring not words, but whether the person before him has truly become someone else. Whatever he found there, it did not erase the past. It did something more difficult. It made a future barely possible. Very gently, he touched her hand. It was such a small contact, but Elena's breath caught as if he had reached into her chest and gripped the years themselves. She turned her hand and held his. For a few quiet seconds, neither of them moved. Then Marcus lifted their joined hands slightly, as though even now he wanted to be careful with the thing between them. I don't know how to do this quickly, he said. We don't do it quickly, she answered. We do it honestly. For the first time since she had entered, the corner of his mouth shifted. Not a full smile. Something better. The beginning of one. They stayed in that office until the light outside thinned into evening. They talked through silences, through shame, through memory. Marcus told her about the warehouse jobs, the shared apartments, the months of numbness after New York, the consulting work that slowly gave him a new sense of self not dependent on being needed by people above him. Elena told him about the board fight, the nights on the kitchen floor, the cities, the false leads, the files she kept with his timeline folded at the edges from being opened too often. At one point she pulled it from her bag and showed him the notes in the margin. He read them quietly. When he reached a page covered in her handwriting, did he eat? Did he hate me? Did he know? His eyes closed for a moment. When he opened them, the distance between them had changed. That is what his hidden worth has always been about. Not perfect people, not clean love, but the buried value of a human heart that keeps giving even after the world misnames it, mocks it, or mistakes its silence for weakness. Some people are treasured late. Some truths arrive years after the wound. But late is not the same as never. Elena did not return to New York alone that night. Marcus did not move back with her, and she did not ask him to. The ending they built was better than a dramatic rush. It was slower, harder, real. She began traveling back to Pennsylvania every week she could. Sometimes they talked for hours. Sometimes they sat with coffee and said almost nothing because healing is not always verbal. Marcus came to New York months later, first for a short visit, then again. Elena introduced him by name, not function, to every person who mattered. The first time someone from the old company referred to him casually as if nothing had happened. Elena corrected them with a level calm that left no room for disrespect. Marcus noticed. He said nothing in the moment. Later, in the car, he took her hand and held it there between them like a quiet acknowledgement that some repairs are made in public. Trust returned by degrees. Desire did too, but in the mature, aching form of people who had already learned how expensive closeness can be. There were late pauses at apartment doors, fingers lingering, breaths shaking, foreheads touching before kisses happened. There were old wounds resurfacing at inconvenient moments, and both of them staying instead of retreating. There were arguments that did not end in humiliation. There were apologies spoken early, not years too late. There was the long, humbling work of building something worthy of the love they had almost destroyed before it had a chance to live. A year later, Marcus accepted a formal role, not as her subordinate. Never that again, but as an independent strategic advisor with his own terms, his own office, his own authority. Elena insisted on all of it. He pushed back on the title twice. She let him. They learned the rhythm of two strong people choosing one another without repeating old violence. Diane met Elena again, and this time, after watching her with Marcus for an afternoon, hugged her before she left. Priya received the promotion she deserved. The company grew. More importantly, it changed. So did Elena. Power did not leave her. It simply stopped being the only language she knew. And when Marcus finally moved back to New York for good, it was not into her life as a man asking to be let in. It was as a man fully seen. Some love stories begin with tenderness. This one began with a report thrown against a loyal man's chest in a glass conference room, and for a long time it looked as though cruelty would be the only thing left standing at the end of it. But love, when it survives honestly, does not survive by pretending nothing happened. It survives by naming the wound, paying its cost, and choosing each other after the truth has stripped away every illusion. He had protected her company when she did not deserve it. She spent years searching for him when she finally understood what she had lost. And when she found him, forgiveness did not come like magic. It came like grace, slow, costly, undeserved, and all the more powerful for that reason. If you were Marcus, could you have forgiven her after everything? Or would some humiliations cut too deep to ever let love return? Tell me in the comments, because stories like this always reveal something about the people listening. And if this one stayed with you, share it with someone who believes quiet people are weak, or that love only counts when it is loud. Sometimes the deepest devotion is the one the world notices last. And sometimes the person treated as least important was the one holding everything together all along. Next time, a woman disappears the night before her wedding and leaves behind one letter, one lie, and one truth the groom won't understand until it's far too late. Stay close.